Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm currently in a hotel in Colorado. Um, I also happens to have the loudest HVAC system I've ever heard. So I hope the audio comes out all right. I did a quick test and it seems to be working okay. After class on Friday, I had a brief question about um, how stringers form. And I thought I'd just hit that real fast. And when we say stringers, we mean these large, uh, these rows of secondary phase uh, precipitates that if you look in the structure in 2D in two directions, this two transverse directions, they look like parallel rows of precipitates. If you look at them from the uh, longitudinal direction, they appear to be precipitates that are strongly on the grain boundary, right? And as I mentioned in class, the when we have equiax grains, our grains are nice spheres, and when we roll them, they become ellipsoids with very high aspect ratios, right? So essentially, they become the top and bottom, the prime along the primary axis of the ellipse. They are like parallel plates. Now, if you have precipitates that have already formed on the grain boundaries and you roll them, that's going to naturally cause them to be aligned on the grain boundaries, but they're also going to get farther apart, right, due to the rolling and the stretching. However, if you say roll before the precipitates form on the grain boundary, and then you have species that strongly segregate to the grain boundary, when you have a squashed grain, the diffusion distance that you have to travel to get all those species to a grain boundary is significantly less. And you can end up with a very dense population of precipitates along the primary axis of the grain ellipsoid, causing these stringers. Right. Where we left off on Friday, we talked about fracture, these large intermetallics, essentially cracking easily and giving you a nice short circuit crack path through your microstructure, right? And we talked about that we want to reduce the level of iron and silicon, right? These are our primary impurities. These are going to cause large coarse intermetallics, right? Submicron particles have good or bad aspects to them, right? The good is they suppress recrystallization, inhibit grain growth, right? Fine unrecrystallized grains, as we see over here, favor high energy absorbing intragranular failure mode, right? If we don't have precipitates along the grain boundary, we're going to force an intragranular failure. And with all these submicron particles, it favors this energy absorbing failure mode, right? But the particles nucleate microvoids due to decohesion, and these are going to link up. But there's always a trade-off, right? You're trading off higher strength and better fracture toughness early for sort of, I'd say, more um, you're forcing a ductile failure, which for the most part is always good, right? You can't get a high toughness without eventually, failure by microvoid formation, right? And that's just the nature of the beast. So maybe I overspoke. That really maybe shouldn't have been bad, right? They're fine precipitates, right? Their presence tends to inhibit deformation, right? These are precipitate or aging, hardening, right? So they make them stronger, but they also cause a localization of slip, right? Once you cut through particles on a plane, you're going to keep cutting through particles on that plane, which could give you strain softening and lead to stress concentrations ahead of advancing crack. So in fatigue in aluminum alloys is quite interesting, right? We've been able to do a lot with the strength. We've been able to really increase the strength through alloying, but we haven't really improved the fatigue life of aluminum along the same way. And I want to make a general point, and this is an important point, so I probably should have put this in a box, that we say that the more an alloy is dependent on precipitation hardening for its strength, the lower the value of the ratio between fatigue and tensile strengths, right? So that means our tensile strength is going up much faster than our fatigue strength, fatigue limit. And right, and that's just a trend we haven't really been able to break away from yet. And we can see this here by looking at the endurance limit, right? Remember, the endurance limit is the stress that if we're below that, no matter how many cycles we have, we're not going to have failure, right? So in this case, it was the tested by doing 500 million cycles at a given stress value. And what we can see here is that if we look at aluminum, as our tensile strength goes up, our endurance limit flattens out, right? For precipitation strength in alloys. For solid solution strength in aluminum alloys, we get much better fatigue for a given tensile strength, right? So if we look at the highest solid solution strength in alloys, around 500 MPa tensile strength, right, we have an endurance limit of greater than 150 MPa rather than around 120 MPa. And if we look at steels or magnesium alloys, you can see that our fatigue, our endurance limit, and our strength have a much stronger positive slope, right? So that means as we get stronger, we also improve our fatigue life. Whereas for aluminum, our strongest alloys do not have a big benefit in fatigue life over weaker alloys, right? Okay, sorry about the jump cut there. I had a minor interruption. So as I was saying, fatigue cracks initiate at the surface where the strain becomes localized due to stress concentrations, right? So what are the sources of stress concentrations that we have to be concerned about? Well, mechanical notches, right? Anything, gouges, scratches at the surface, anything that's going to cause stress to be concentrated, right? We also have to worry about corrosion pitting, right? Anytime you have surface that is eaten away by corrosion, you're also forming a stress concentration there. It's especially dangerous because most of the time when we're in a highly corrosive environment, such as, say, seawater, we also have to worry about hydrogen, in hydrogen embrittlement, and other factors. Especially given the complicated electrochemistry of aluminum systems, this becomes a real nasty problem to deal with. We also have to worry about coarse slip bands. If we have slip bands that are intersecting the surface, they can make steps on the surface, which will also act as stress concentration. Also, these slip bands will tend to, where we had lots of shear localization, will tend to cut particles, right? And this is something we keep talking about, is cutting particles and dissolving particles because of shear activity. So fatigue in general in precipitate strengthened aluminum alloy systems becomes unfavorable, right? We're not as good. Generally, fatigue in our age-hardened systems is not as good as fatigue in solid solution strengthened systems, right? We have to remember that we're in a metastable microstructure state, right? We have to worry about how that structure evolves during cyclic loading. And if we have localization of strain, right, we've already said this leads to removal of particles and slip bands, which is going to accelerate cracking. We'll have softening in that region because the particles disappear. We'll have more strain being localized to the slip bands, which is going to really accelerate our failure. Right? And remember that as we cut these particles, they become smaller. Right? If we have a particle that hypothetically is just slightly larger than R star, so it's thermodynamically stable and it's going to grow. But if we cut it, we put a bunch of dislocations through it, and we split them into two particles that are each smaller than our critical nucleus size, they're going to shrink and disappear. Also, even if they're larger than R star, through the process of coarsening and Ostwald ripening, those particles will disappear faster than neighboring. But the key thing we have to worry about is when they become too small for thermodynamic stability. Right? So we want to try and do anything that's going to delocalize slip if we want to enhance our fatigue properties. What can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is we can put in non-soluble intermetallics. Right? So, which means we get the kind of confusing result that impure alloys are better than pure ones for fatigue life. So here's a quick example of that, where we have alloy 2024, which is the aluminum copper system, alloy X2024, where the X is high purity, and we can see that the standard alloy has a higher, for any given stress value, has a higher cycles to failure. Right? So why on earth is this? We usually think of when we have better controls on our chemistry, we have higher properties. But in this case, it's the effect of manganese impurities. Right? We have magnesium aluminide particles, MnAl6, that are large enough that they disrupt the shear localization that happens in the repeated cutting of particles, and their presence imparts a much more uniform slip over the entire grain. Right? Thermomechanical treatments are actually another way of doing this. So these are 7000 series alloys, same composition, but under the thermomechanical, when they undergo thermomechanical processing, which is cold work and then a stabilizing heat treatment, right, we're able to increase the yield strength due to the work hardening, but also increase our cycles to failure. Right? Right? So if we thermally treated, right? So what's going on during this thermomechanical processing? Well, we're introducing a whole bunch of dislocations, and then heating it up, and so that's going to encourage the heterogeneous nucleation of secondary phase particles and cause the current particles to grow by coarsening. Right? So if we look at an example and look at the effect of microstructure on the fatigue life, we'll see that microstructure has a much greater influence on fatigue properties in aluminum than on tensile properties. Right? And so let's take a look at aluminum magnesium in the solid solution state, and aluminum magnesium silver in the solid solution state, basically in the as quench condition, and you'll see they have very good fatigue resistance. Right? So for a given stress, we have a large number of cycles to failure. Right? So our endurance limit here is the stress that we can cycle this for essentially forever without any failure. Right? So if we extrapolate this out to infinite number of cycles, that's our endurance limit. So in the solid solution, supersaturated solid solution state, the as quench condition, we have an endurance limit of 87 megapascals, which is about the same as the yield stress, right? In this case, it was measured at 85 megapascals. If we can attribute this high endurance limit to the fact that it's in a solid solution strength. There's nothing in there that's going to contribute to slip localization. If we do the ternary alloy and we age harden it, our endurance limit decreases to 48 megapascals, but our yield strength increases to 200 megapascals, right? This is due completely to particle cutting and strain localization. If we overage it, right? If we go to the overage condition, our yield strength drops to 175, but our endurance limit goes back up to 72 megapascals, right? And this is, we're going to grow large particles, right? We're going to nucleate our second phase heterogeneously and grow large particles and have much more uniform slip in our system. Right? Aluminum as I said before, doesn't work harden significantly. It doesn't have a high hardening rate. It's not like steels in that regard, that we can get a big boost in flow stress. So if we look at the yield stress as a function of reduction by cold working, right? This isn't a stress strain curve. So this is, I took a sample, I rolled it to 50%, and then I did a stress strain test on that. And I looked at where my proof stress, my yield stress is. Right? And we can see that we get a big boost in the beginning, but then it sort of saturates out. Right? And the other thing that is interesting is this is bottom line is 1100. This is pure aluminum. And up here, 5000 series and the 3000 series. And you can see they're pretty parallel. Right? The hardening behavior is not changed all that much by the alloying. Right? All we're doing is essentially shifting the initial yield strength up before cold working. Right? But during forming and working, we can get fairly large strains in. Right? So we can supplement the strengthening of precipitation strengthened alloys through cold working. Right? So we see a rapid increase in the yield strength, but the trade-off is we see a huge decrease in the ductility with cold working. Right? So we can see in all of these alloys, we go from about 40% elongation down to less than 10 when we have significant cold working in there. You notice 3000 series doesn't drop quite as fast. Right? They have better drawing properties in the cold work. And this is the important alloy for beer cans, right? Because we have to go through a deep drawing step, and we need them to be still workable for our thin-walled beverage cans. The end result of this is strain hardening tempers are not employed when we still need to do a lot of workability. We'll talk about this in the next lecture when we look at commercially important alloys, and I'll go through the temper designations. And one of the temper designations is H, is work hardened, and the amount of strain that's put in. And so when you want to need to do further things to your alloys, you're probably going to avoid an H temper. So work hardening of our alloy is given by, we can look at this using just the standard power law hardening model that you learned about in Material Science 1. All right. So this is our true stress. This is our stress at a strain of 1. All right. Our true strain, and this is the work hardening coefficient. All right. So what I really want to point out is that there's a significant difference in work hardening with temperature. So here we'll take a look at commercially pure aluminum. At low temperatures, we work harden at a much faster rate than at room temperature. All right. So at 20 C, minus 196 C versus room temperature 20 C. Sorry, thinking Kelvin for a second. 20 Kelvin versus 196 Kelvin instead of minus 196C and 20C. Right? Right? And this higher work hardening rate at low temperatures is because we don't have dynamic recovery and recrystallization. Right? Our thermally activated recovery mechanisms are not available. For all things aluminum, cross slip is really important. The ease at which aluminum cross slips because of the high stacking fault energy, right, means that in general our work hardening rates are going to be very low, right? And whenever we're thinking about forming, we really have to think about what our temperature is that we're going to be working at, because it's going to be a trade-off between strengthening and hardening rates versus workability due to recovery and recrystallization at higher temperatures. Right. Substructure hardening we talked about a lot during the strengthening section. Right. Again, it's an effect similar to a Hall-Petch effect, but not as strong. Right. Remember, we've got high stacking fault energy, lots of cross slip available, and we're going to have lots of substructure formation. Right, with tend to be much narrower cell walls, right? And we talked about textures. Oops. Right, how textures form, the rotations associated with plastic deformation, and that under certain deformations we tend to get predominant textures. So rod and bar aluminum stock tends to have a fiber texture, which we have the 100 direction parallel to the axis of the product, right? But random orientations perpendicular to the long axis of the product. And then rolled sheet has a very common, what we call FCC rolling texture, right? And it's actually what I would call a surface texture, but right. On annealing, we get new grains that form, and much of our preferred orientation is lost. We can get annealing textures, which is that cube texture, right? Our grains are well aligned. The edges of our unit cells are well aligned with the orthogonal axes of our rolling sample, right? And I just want to point out that this texturing, while not really critical for the class, it is important to know that it can have an effect. So this is deep drawing of cups, which is like the first step of making a can, and you can see this inhomogeneity, this what we call earring at the top. And this is completely due to the texture that develops. And a huge amount of money was spent trying to understand how this texture developed and develop sheets that have a good starting texture so that when you draw them, they don't form this earring behavior. Because this is wasted material. If you want to make a can out of this, you have to cut that all off. and recycle. It creates a lot of scrap, a lot of waste material, and a lot of additional cost in the manufacturing process, and that's all due to the texture that develops during deformation. Again, the textures that I'm talking about here are not particularly important, or it's not important to know what a rod or bar aluminum texture is, what a rolling texture looks like in aluminum. That's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here. What I do think is important is to understand that all of the aspects of microstructure are tied together. Your thermal history and your alloying composition are going to dictate what type of precipitate structure you're going to have. The precipitate structure dictates what's going to happen on deformation. What happens on deformation talks about how your textures evolve. How your textures evolve gives you anisotropy in the properties and the performance of your finished product. It's all tied together, and you can't necessarily separate out one from the other. But just think a little bit about the big picture. That's kind of what I wanted to get across with these last couple.